thank Scott and his team. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Drew Martin from Untitled Fisheries, and with my teammates Aaron Moses from Redfish West, Scott Kenny from Ridley Aquafeed, Peter Suggested from the Department of Ag, and Jeremy Huddleston, a owner-operator abdiver from Tassie. We are asking you all, where do you stand? So our project aims to influence Australian seafood stakeholders and communities to effectively do the right thing through peer and self-assessment. We will deliver this message through a campaign with the slogan, "Where do you stand, above or below the line?" This concept is based on a management tool that helps assess if behaviours and decisions are above or below the line. So behaviours that we've identified together that we believe sit below the line are blaming others, making excuses, accepting bad practice, denial, waiting for others, ignoring the problem and finding faults. And behaviours we've identified that sit above the line include seeking solutions, solving problems, taking responsibility, owning it, best practice, taking action and accountability. So we all know in the seafood industry we're all faced with problems and decisions on a daily basis, and it's really how we approach these problems and decisions that dictates the outcome. So what we believe is if we sit below the line when making decisions, the long-term outcome is normally a negative one. If we sit above the line, the long-term outcome is usually a positive one. So we believe the campaign will enable seafood stakeholders and communities, rec fishers, skippers, crews, managers, CEOs, government departments, research departments, friends, families, to assess their current behaviours and future decisions. So we believe the concept can be applied to many challenges the seafood industry faces, some of which we'll address throughout the presentation, including mental health, responsible recreational fishing, aquaculture, biosecurity and invasive species. So the first slide is mental health. We've got a poor fisherman down here, a victim of below the line sort of decisions. A few of us were looking a little bit like him this morning, but we've all recovered. So below the line behaviour for mental health is sort of having no policies, training, support programs or awareness. The "You'll Be Right, Mate" policy, which we probably all know is fairly common in the seafood industry. Unfair working conditions and unsafe practices, unstable government policy, which caused a lot of uncertainty among fishing communities that rely on seafood as their main income, and condoning the stigma around mental health. Things that lie above the line is providing training and awareness, anti-bullying and harassment policies, enjoyable and safe working conditions, accessible mental health support programs, which will link into the last group there. Simply asking colleagues and workmates, are you okay? And helping breaking the stigma, just talking about is an above the line behaviour. I'll pass you on to Aaron.
Thank you, Drew. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Aaron Moses and I'm from Redfish West in WA. And today I'm going to be asking you, where do you stand in regards to catch care and the correct disposal of fishing gear? While recreational fishing is generally accepted by the wider community, if we don't adapt to changing social norms, the non-fishing community is likely to be quite swift in their condemnation of the sector's actions. We need to realise that behaviour that was once socially acceptable is no longer necessarily accepted today. Things such as holding up fish by their gills and not supporting their spine and can actually do some severe damage to their internal organs. While leaving fish out bleeding and gasping for air is not essentially an illegal activity, it's a bad look for the sector. Overhandling fish and also catching and releasing vulnerable demersal species, which don't always survive after releasing them. So what are some above the line behaviours that we can employ? if we want to catch and release fish, use knotless landing nets. That does less damage to their scales, leaves a lot more slime on there, prevents them from getting diseases later on. Supporting the body weight of the fish for the reasons I mentioned below. If you're going to release fish, swim it prior to being released, assist it before you do so. And if you're going to keep a fish for a feed, dispatch them humanely. Recreational fishing can be a messy pastime. However, this doesn't mean that the environment we conduct our activities in needs to suffer as a consequence. Incorrect disposal of bait bags, fishing lines, hooks, lures, etc. in and around our waterways is not only a terrible look, also bad for the native wildlife. This is when we have to ask ourselves a simple question: where do I stand on the disposal of fishing gear? Leaving old bait bags in the environment and unnecessary use of plastic are some of the below the line behaviours. However, correctly disposing of your old bait bags, fishing lines in designated bins along rivers and popular fishing locations is something we can do to help out. If you were to see any wildlife, bird life in distress, carefully untangle them. However, if you are unable to, contact the relevant authorities. If you are out on your boats having a good day out fishing, keep your waste well stored away. And most importantly, invest in non-plastic alternatives. I know where I stand in regards to being above the line in my recreational fishing practices. I will be taking this message back to my workplace at Breakfish West, spreading the word and asking the recreational fishers of Western Australia, where do you stand? And I'll pass you over to Scott.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Scott Kenny. I am from Ridley Aquafeed in Queensland. So my slide's on aquaculture. Some of the below the line practices in the aquaculture sector. In the aquaculture sector, it is essential for the future of the seafood industry and is the lifeblood for my family and many others in Australia. Some of the below the line behaviours can be seen in the aquaculture industry are unhealthy animals through miscare, poor water quality, and the failure to work at best practice. Environmental damage, which can cause uproar in communities, and the long-term consequences for flora and fauna. Ultimately, this can bring a business crashing down, including the loss of jobs. Poor work practices, increasing the risk of harm to workers. I believe that everyone deserves to return home from work in the healthiest possible condition, free from injury or distress. Images such as algae bloom can quickly reach a widespread community right throughout the country, making news, social media posts, which can ultimately cause questions around aquaculture practices and how they affect the environment. Some above the line behaviours that we can use in the aquaculture industry. In simple terms, healthy water ensures healthy fish. Healthy fish and the consumption of this equals healthy humans. Risk assessments and standard operating procedures developed to ensure the highest possible safety for people and the animals. These safe work practices are imperative to making sure our people arrive home safely to their families and to uphold the future of our community. Presenting beautiful fish in co-ops and supermarkets. They just paint a picture of the industry and show everybody the hard work that we do. Harmonising with all these above the line practices presents aquaculture to be socially acceptable. I'll now pass you on to Peter.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Peter Stouser-Stokes. I'm the Director of Aquatic and Marine Biosecurity at the Department of Agriculture. I'd just like to spend a little time discussing my observations around the recent white spot disease outbreak in southern Queensland. I assume that all of you are somewhat aware of that. After the outbreak, I was observing in my department and in other agencies some behaviour which could be described as below the line. There was a fair bit of blame shifting, there was excuses made, and there was denial of responsibility. Now that happened in my organisation, but I also saw it happening in others. I saw it happening in state governments, I saw it happening in industry associations. So the interaction between those organisations to come to a good outcome was impeded by those behaviours. But then natural behaviours is nothing quite like a crisis to bring out the worst in people. However, although some might not agree, the outcome was reasonably good compared to what it could have been if we had stayed below the line. So I saw people taking ownership across those groups I talked about. State governments, federal government, industry, and FRDC for that matter. People started to be accountable for fixing the problem. And people took responsibility where they should. So, I'm not sure if you know it, the biosecurity system in Australia is actually behind the scenes. It has a concept which is biosecurity is a shared responsibility. That means it's shared between the Commonwealth, the states, industry per se, at the other end. So, what I'd like to do, or what our group thought might be a good thing, is to concentrate on biosecurity in our industries and try to get them to understand the responsibility they have. So this one's around agriculture biosecurity. What we would see as below the line behaviours are really using food for human consumption. I set rules for import of seafood for human consumption, and I can tell you we have a leakage rate. We can't completely stop it, but we do accept some risk. But that risk is magnified when people behave in ways that are contrary to the way we see the system working. If a product is labelled for human consumption, not for bait and feed use, we hope people will take notice of that label. But as we know, that's not always the case. So please, the agriculture industry should concentrate on using the appropriate feeds for their operations. If you don't screen the broodstock when you bring it into your agriculture facility, you're asking for disease effectively. If you don't treat your water, you'll get whatever's in the water coming into your ponds and system. If you allow free access to your premises, you're allowing people to bring anything in they like, whether intentionally or unintentionally. And if you don't manage all your disease pathways, which are generally associated with all the inputs coming into your operation, you're again asking for problems around biosecurity. And your staff not aware of those things, they cannot help their organisation or your agency or operation to manage their biosecurity. So the key thing really for an agriculture operation is to have a biosecurity plan, a good one, and implement it. Biosecurity plans will cover issues such as safe feed. How do you source it, what you accept and what you won't accept. How to bring in broodstock into your operation, or juveniles, disease-free juveniles. It will document what's expected of your organisation with water and environment management to reduce disease. It will control, or will have things in place for vector and access control. So people control, input control, to make sure they're biosecure. And if you have aware staff about all those systems, then they will implement them for you. There's also issues around biosecurity and recreational fishing. Below the line behaviours in this particular sector are using seafood purchased for human consumption for bait. I mentioned the reasons for that before. I can tell you now that there is some leakage. So some of the seafood that comes into Australia may be diseased. Putting your household waste in Burley is another thing you really shouldn't do. There's lots of food products and food we eat that has diseases that won't affect us, but can affect other organisms. Moving bait around the country is not really a good idea because you just move any diseases associated with that bait to another place. And releasing aquarium fish to the environment is just not a very sensible thing to do because those fish, majority of them, are imported. We know there are some diseases associated with them, and we know there's been disease outbreaks when you release fish for feed into the environment. So what can you do? Well, you can just go to the bait shop generally, plan your fishing, plan when you need to use your bait, and go and get it from a reputable or safe source. Use locally sourced fresh bait if you really want to use your own, catch your own, use it locally and catch it locally. Keep your seafood home, in your fridge, where it belongs, and encourage your mates to do the same thing. Encourage your mates to behave appropriately when they go out and access your environmental resource. I'll now hand over to Jeremy.
Thanks very much, Peter. My name is Jeremy Huddlestone. I'm a commercial wild catch abalone diver based in Tasmania. And today I'd like to speak about some invasive species, in particular 2 case studies and some actions or behaviours of people operating above or below the line in our sector and the different outcomes that can stem from these actions. So we see below the line on our first slide the seaweed species Undaria or wakame, which is native to Japan and was left to expand on Tasmania's east coast in the early 1990s. It's an extremely fast marine growing plant which creates an almost single species marine environment and displaces other native marine plants. Luckily for us, it had a commercial value, which made it easier to manage and helps in cost recovery. Harvest of Undaria peaked in 2008 at 250 tonnes a year. It's now hard to harvest more than 20 tonnes per annum in those same areas. And by demonstrating above the line behaviours and getting in and having a go, the Undaria was removed and native marine species have returned. What's coming next? The Tasmanian Centro sea urchin. This is not just isolated to Tasmania either. I should point out it's a larger problem. Largely out of sight, out of mind mentality, sea urchins have created large-scale damage to marine environments globally. As seen in the photo below the line, unchecked, large populations can be devastating to marine environments. Flow-on effects and inaction below the line include tourism downturn due to less recreational diving industry, high-value commercial species quota reduction, and eventually population crashes. Leaves huge economic impacts into coastal towns and communities. So what are we doing about it? We have approved and funded a project which will access the Abalone Industry Reinvestment Fund. The AIRF is a fund championed by a former NSILP graduate and is a collaboration between government and industry. The project will focus on highly productive areas of Tasmania's east coast and control sea urchin populations before barrens are formed, and therefore protect biodiversity in these key areas. stage one of our project, $28,000 allocated in the iconic Eagle Hawk Neck region, which is a hugely popular area of Tasmanian Peninsula. It will be completed by mid-October this year, and a follow-up stage 2 will be completed in April 2020. By completing these projects and proving the results, we'll use this model to encourage other fishers and ocean users to move above the line and protect their patch for our future generations. Thank you.
So implementation, how are we going to do this? How's this project going to roll out? The next step for our group is the implementation phase, and we have big plans for the future of this concept. We will find a website host with companies and organisations such as SIA, Recfish West and FRDC. We will guide the development of the platform to run this concept, such as campaigns, advertising with QR codes or other tools. This will link many other great organisations and other campaigns that have the love for the seafood industry just as much as we do. We commit to spread the word, where do you stand? The banner using proven social media platforms such as Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. We will assess and review the effectiveness of this program to ensure it is relevant now and into the future. We have already started the advertising campaign with the stickers that you guys would have seen on your seats or in your packs. Please feel free to ask for more of these stickers so you can share the concept with your network and get the ball rolling here in our nation's capital. As Jeremy said, we have already secured funding for 2 projects to remove the invasive species that have a detrimental effect to our environment. Of these 2 projects, one of them will start within the next month and the other will be completed before the end of the financial year. We also envisage that more projects just like this will be invested into the near future and right throughout this beautiful country we live in to minimise the effects of the invasive species. Thank you.
Right, so our group has had a long and challenging leadership journey. After the first residential in Hobart, we weren't quite sold on our initial concept and couldn't quite come to an agreement. In Sydney, we made a team decision to scrap it and explore other options. What we decided on was that changing the views and attitudes of the Australian fishing sector was a key issue facing it. We faced further challenges. We came from 4 different states with varying work schedules, which often got in the way of our meetings that we scheduled. Through the National Seafood Industry Leadership Program, our views were challenged. We often thrown in the deep end and out of our comfort zone. However, ultimately, it taught us to work closely and effectively with representatives from the varying sectors, some who had conflicting interests. In conclusion, we know where we stand, so we'd like to ask you, where do you stand? Thank you.